Hello students, this is Heidi Albin. I want to apologize in advance that my voice sounds like a brain-dead chipmunk on any sort of technical device. So please just, I don't know, bear with me. I'm going to record this chapter lecture in a couple different parts because I don't want it to get too big for you to load onto your computer. So we're just going to go ahead and do this in parts. So I guess we'll go ahead and start. This chapter is going to be about antimicrobial drugs. And when we look at antimicrobial drugs, there's a few terms that we need to know before we get started. First of all, we talked before about how chemotherapy is just using drugs, using chemicals to treat disease. And a lot of times we tend to think of it as being used for cancer, but really chemo is chemical and therapy is the treatment of a disease. Antimicrobial drugs are going to be those that interfere with the growth of any microbe. Okay, so all antibiotics are going to be antimicrobial drugs, but not all antimicrobial drugs are antibiotics. Kind of like all apples are fruit, but not all fruit are apples. When we use an antimicrobial drug, we want it to have selective toxicity, and that means that it will kill the harmful microbes but not damage the host. For instance, if you have a terrible infection in your intestines, you could drink a whole bunch of bleach and it would probably kill that infection, but it would also kill you. So we don't want that. We want something that will hurt the pathogen without damaging the host. When we look at antibiotics, we're interested in their spectrum. The spectrum is the range of microorganisms that it can affect. And so microorganisms will have, well, let's see, antimicrobes will have two different ranges of spectrums, and that can be broad or narrow. A broad spectrum antibiotic or antimicrobial is going to obviously affect a broad range of both gram-negative or gram-positive if we're talking about bacteria, where a narrow spectrum is only going to affect a relatively small number of organisms. For instance, penicillin G only affects gram-positive bacteria, so that would be a relatively narrow spectrum antimicrobial drug. Here is a table of a lot of the several different drugs, 9 of them, that shows how they react in their different spectrums. We see that tetracycline is effective against gram-negative, gram-positive bacteria, and also chlamydias and whatnot. And so we would tend to think if someone has an infection, well, let's just go ahead and give them tetracycline if it's gram-negative, gram-positive, or chlamydias, or ehrlichia, whatever. But that's actually not a really good idea because it can result in what we call superinfection. If you're in my class, you remember us talking about Clostridium difficile and how when antibiotics are used, that C. diff can form spores which will survive the antibiotics, and once the antibiotics are gone and have killed all of the competitors, the C. diff spores can germinate and then cause a terrible C. diff infection, and then you have to take a poo slushy and all that fun stuff. And so we call that superinfection. That's when a broad spectrum antibiotic doesn't kill a certain organism but does kill its competitors, and then that microorganism can flourish. So broad spectrum aren't necessarily what you always want to use. We're going to talk about the 5 main actions of antimicrobial drugs, and there's all antimicrobial drugs will use these same 5 actions. Sorry guys, this is really difficult to do when I'm not in front of a class, so forgive the pausing and just not being super great at this. It's really awkward. Notice that these are actions of all antimicrobial drugs. This isn't just specific for antibiotics. Some of these actions will only work on antibiotics, some will only work on fungi, and etc. So anyway, they can work in 5 different ways. You need to pay attention to what types of drugs work in the 5 different ways. In this lecture, I'm going to describe the 5 different actions to you, but you need to know which drugs use that mode of action. For instance, you need to know that penicillin works by preventing the cell wall synthesis. Here's a really nifty picture that you can't see the entire thing of. Hold on. There we go. All right. that just kind of summarizes the action of antimicrobial drugs. You have some that will, number one, inhibit cell wall synthesis. And again, these are examples of the antimicrobial drugs that will do that. We'll talk about that, each of these in depth here in a second. You can inhibit protein synthesis. You can inhibit nucleic acid replication. You can inhibit synthesis of essential metabolites, and you can also just injure the plasma membrane. So let's look at each of these more in depth. And actually, I'm going to go ahead and pause this or stop this first recording here before we get to 6 minutes so that it will load on everyone's computers more easily. So I will go over the next in the next section.